for joining the CTIPP CAN call today on how to advocate and promote trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered legislation and other work that just helps build the movement. As we'll get into, there are many ways that we can advocate, and everybody's voice and position has power in this movement. And so for the next minute or so, we will continue to see where parts on the map populate and pop up. We've never tried this before and are very excited to see it. If folks have feedback, we see some work in the chat also coming in. And we'll leave this map up for about a minute longer to see how it works. And in the meantime, while we're doing this, Dan, if you want to go ahead and get started with some of the work that Labor H has been doing. And the appropriations bill, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Jess. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We've talked over probably every CTIPP CAN call since we began, because our name is community advocacy, is that the best way to make improvements in federal legislation and funding programs is advocacy by all of you. And we now actually have proof that it works. Every year, Congress has to pass an appropriations bill broken out by subcommittee. And the subcommittee that impacts the programs we care most about is the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and related agencies. And 4 years ago, when we first started, you would not find any reference to trauma or ACEs in their material. And they put out two documents. One, they put out an appropriations bill, which lists how much money is going to each program. But then they also put out a report, and the report is the pregnant document. It explains why they gave money to particular programs or gave increases to particular programs. But in addition, they give instructions to the different agencies on activities, actions they want them to take, reports they want them to prepare. And then they just make broad statements that set out their philosophical framework. And we're really pleased when the appropriations report came out from the House of Representatives this year. It is chock full of reference to ACEs and funding for ACEs. And it's really the result of all the advocacy everybody on this call and beyond that has done. Jesse has put in the chat box a memo we prepared that highlights the various reference to ACEs, or in some cases to things like social emotional learning that is close to ACEs, or programs promoting infant and early childhood mental health programs. But in addition, the report gives $7 million to the CDC for their ACE program. And that's the program they've used this year to fund 4 states to help them develop trauma-informed statewide programs. They had $2 million this past year. Now they'll have $7 million. And that means they'll be able to do 7 states, more than doubling or almost doubling their results. The committee also gave $1 million to the Interagency Task Force on Trauma created by the Support Act. It's an interagency program that has great potential, but sat pretty much dormant during the previous administration. And we know that the present administration wants to do something with it, but without money, there's not much they can do. They'll now get $1 million, which will enable them to hire staff, which is really the key. Federal agencies don't do much if there's no staff specifically dedicated to it. So we're really optimistic that in the coming year, the Interagency Task Force, bringing together all of the different agencies who impact trauma and trauma-informed programs, are going to start working together in the way the authors, Senator Durbin and Senator Heitkamp, envisioned for that program. Committee also gave $25 million to baby courts, something we've talked about during some of our CTIPP CAN calls, which really are trauma-informed entities. The committee told HRSA, the Health Resources Services Administration, to address trauma. One of the accomplishments that we're proudest of is that we all know about the BRFAS program that gives states some funding to track trauma. And we suggested that the BRFAS program also start attracting resilience, because we know that resilience has a real impact on the how much effect trauma has on people. So the committee has directed CDC to come, SAMHSA to come back to it with a report on whether it recommends the inclusion of material on resilience in the BRFAS program. So that will give you data freaks a whole new area to write journal articles on, or your PhD thesis, whichever you're working on. And if you go through the report, there's just lots of great stuff in there. But let me just conclude by reading what the committee said in one parts of it. It said, the committee is aware that childhood trauma and toxic stress have been linked to negative health outcomes throughout adulthood, including higher rates of diabetes, stroke, depression, lapses in cognitive ability, developmental delays, suicide, and substance abuse, among others. Low-income children are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. So the committee gets it. That's as good a summary of everything we've been talking about all these years. And they now have it in black and white. What the committee hasn't done yet is apply that awareness to all of the programs that they fund. They fund, I don't know, it's 200 and some odd billion dollars worth of programs. And a lot of those are block grant programs, like the mental health block grant, the substance abuse block grant, the community development block grant, the children families block grant. And they didn't put any language in any of those block grants or the Head Start program or Title I of the Education Act, directing those agencies to direct their grantees to start putting the awareness of trauma into their program. So that's our goal for the future, and everybody on this call can help with that, to help us educate the Appropriations Committee on how it can integrate its awareness into all of the programs. So someday we'll pick up this report and there'll be $260 billion worth of trauma-informed programs. So we're excited about how much has been achieved. Thank you all for your hard work, but we also know how much more work we have to do. So we look forward to working with you going forward to make that happen. Jesse?
Thanks, Dan. And thank you for the call to action, which so perfectly leads us into our advocacy workshop as we continue to work to build the movement. Like Dan said 5 years ago, we did not see any discussion or language in this bill. And now we see 31 different programs that are funded. And so the work that you all as advocates and as just people working on this in the field and in communities is making a huge, huge difference. And we want to continue to do that work around the country to meet Dan's lofty goal of having every dollar in the bill directed toward trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered work. And so, Whitney, if you're able to pull up the slides, and the other thing that I wasn't able to do was add the PDF into the chat. So if you're able to do that, that would be great. If not, I will be sending out the PDF of our slides at the end of the presentation in our normal follow-up, as well as in our PACES connection post, if that's where you found out about CTIPP CAN. If you did find out about us through PACES connection and want to be added to our listserv, please feel free to message me in the chat and I will add your email to that. But this is a trauma-informed policy advocacy workshop session. We are so excited to have all of you here with us today. Speaking will be Dan, myself, Jesse, and Whitney Marris, who is also a valued member of the National Trauma Campaign core team and also a recent graduate of the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, and a consultant with them, as well as working toward her clinical licensure. And so on the next slide, where we're going to start is some predictions, acknowledgements, and disclaimers. Pads, I almost forgot about them. So just to mention, there are varying levels of sophistication in this group, and we welcome everybody that's here. Advocating to elected officials, or even within sectors, may look different depending on the political party, the key issues and interests, or the area of work that you all do. Not everyone in the group may want to advocate to their elected officials, but still may want to play a role in building the movement. And again, like I said early on in the call, we welcome everybody's perspective and want and willingness to participate, because there are so many roles that we need to fill as we continue to build this movement. There may be some discomfort as well as excitement in sharing your story during the small breakout rooms that we'll get to later on with people that you may or may not know. And we recognize that, but are excited for that part of this workshop, for this to be more interactive and for you all to engage in that. And there may be some information that you wish that we would have been able to cover, but we may not get to. And so we welcome emails and for this to be an ongoing dialogue as this continues. So on the next slide, we want to model, which I'll get to in a second, how we actually want to advocate, which is how we set up these slides, which is leading with the why, which I'll get to in a second. But why advocate, right? To me, advocacy is more than just talking to elected officials. It's working toward the world that we want to see. And there are so many ways to do that. Discussing with elected officials policies and legislation, or letting them know about the work that's going on in their districts, is certainly an important aspect. But we are working toward the world that we want to see. And for me, at least, this has provided meaning and also healing in my own life, especially since I've gotten involved with CTIPP and the National Trauma Campaign. It has allowed for my past experiences for me to find meaning in those and try to help other people, which has been a major, major healing experience for me in my own life. Acknowledging past pain points and ensuring that others don't need to go through those, or trying to make sure that those don't need to be repeated, provides that meaning. We know that the world's practices, that our country's practices, are currently unsustainable, and there needs to be change. There's hope, though, and there is time for things to get better, but we need to work toward it, and there is no better time and place to start than now. Many of you have been doing this for years and years and years, and we want to encourage you to continue. But for those of you who may just be getting off the ground with this, there is no better place and time to start than here and now. And your voice matters. We talk about how empowerment is antithetical to trauma. So many times trauma strips our voices away. And by finding your voice and being a part of this movement, it can help lead to that growth and healing. So on the next slide, we see that why, how, what, the golden circle that was created by Simon Sinek. Not myself, not smart enough to create it, just wise enough to use the great knowledge that is out there. And when we're advocating, we want to lead with the why. As you can see, the human brain that is sort of catty to it, leading with the why gets to people's limbic brains, the emotional centers of the brain, and really tugs at the heartstrings. Leading with the why is, and getting to people's hearts, is where people make decisions from. We then go out to provide context with the how and what that allows for people to justify the decisions that they're making with their hearts. But we want to lead with the why and really get to that emotional center on the brain. And then this last slide before I turn it over to Whitney, who has just a way with words that you will enjoy far more than my own, is the treatment model, or the public health model, that we really need to work for as advocates in this space. Because when we talk about mental health, like when we talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, which talks about mental health many, many, many times, but not necessarily trauma-informed care, we are working against a paradigm that many people have that associate mental health specifically with treatment. And while we recognize that treatment is important, we know that we don't have the clinical workforce to meet the need that currently exists in our country and continues to grow. We need to continue to work toward prevention. And that is a goal for us as advocates. That is something that we continue to be called to do is work toward preventing at a systems level universal precautions that keep people from becoming so dysregulated that they get referred to counselors, which is currently how a lot of systems operate. We can keep people in zones of regulation. We can promote resiliency broadly throughout society. And that is the beauty of what working toward trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered work comes from. And so with that, I will turn it over to Whitney Marris to talk about how to advocate. And then we'll go to Dan with the what to advocate for right now.
Thanks, Jesse. And also just want to lift up a comment in the chat. If you don't mind dropping that document in there one more time that you were dropping before, that'd be fantastic. Thank you so much. And so, yes, I am going to talk at you for a bit about some considerations that in our experience can be really helpful to consider in guiding advocacy efforts such that they're meaningful, relevant, and impactful. And this will look different for each of you. This framework is really sort of open and very customizable and individualized based on a variety of factors. And hopefully this framework is just a helpful anchor for you to consider how you can build it out, informed by your expertise of your local area, your state, your community, as you're the experts of your own spots. And so first, it's really vital to know your audience. So to whom you're advocating. A good starting point in our experience is to really seek out information on what's important to them, such that you're attuned to what they value, which will help you start where they're at and not where we might wish they were or where we might want them to end up or be. And this slide just has some considerations basically. And if you can find information on things like how often someone has written, sponsored, or co-sponsored legislation that relates to topics relevant to trauma-informed change, or maybe take a look at people's voting histories, that information is often available. See if they have interest, how they vote on similar topics. You can start to get a sense of what motivates them and what they already value, where we can align with them on this. And in addition to some of these just basic considerations and looking into the background of your specific advocacy targets, we also want to talk a little bit about how useful it can be to familiarize yourself with the general landscape about topics relevant to your advocacy efforts. And when it comes to integrating trauma-informed policies and practices, impactful programming, and promising interventions, these already exist in a large capacity. Based on the document that Jesse is putting in the chat, we know that people are on board with these ideas. There's action happening, there are models to look to, and there are actions that can be replicated across your area to support individual and collective healing and resiliency. And if you're a regular participant on these calls, you've probably heard many examples that resonated with you that you might be able to call to when we're looking at how we can successfully implement trauma-informed and resilience-informed and healing-centered action. And there may not be a need, so to speak, for you to reinvent the wheel in whatever solutions that you're proposing. And it can also be helpful to really take a look at other legislative examples of how similar funding to what we're talking about today has been distributed to advance a trauma and resilience-informed approach. I actually track some of this information federally and across states. So I have this 200+ page document detailing legislative efforts that I can drop in the chat a little bit later that you might find interesting, might be a good barometer to say, in this state, they were implementing this particular policy in this way using this funding. What would that look like in our place? And how can we use that successful implementation and translate that to our advocacy efforts and use that as inspiration and evidence for our own, what we are looking to accomplish. And again, the fact that this is over 200 pages, this document now really says a lot about how promising efforts really can be. So much is happening, as Dan and Jesse mentioned in the beginning of this meeting. There is a lot of trauma-informed action that you can look to inspire your efforts and see what's working, see what other people are up to. And as you examine other examples of what's already happening, consider what you know about your community or your state and what's already in place resource-wise to implement the change that you're advocating for, things like funding, staffing, infrastructure, programming, things like that. And including this information with your proposed solutions, we've learned can be really influential in your advocacy efforts. So just some high-level points here for you to review in your time. And as you take a look at that information, you may notice that your advocacy target is already talking this talk or walking this walk themselves. Woohoo, that is fabulous and exciting. If people are already proposing or implementing policy changes aligned with your efforts, or they sit on relevant committees and seem to be interested in this content, you may not have to do as much educating or convincing. And you may even have a champion on your hands, which is someone who is really likely to file, enthusiastically sponsor, or otherwise propel policies and programming that are aligned with your efforts forward. And also importantly, someone who may actively solicit their colleagues to support your advocacy goals as well. So remember that people can assume leadership positions over time as well. So even if the person that you're talking to who seems to champion this is not necessarily the head of a committee or seemingly has a lot of influence right now, members really can work their way up to being committee heads. They can have a lot of influence in a lot of different ways. So know that any allies that you can find are fantastic and valuable, and those relationships must be nurtured. So if you find yourself in this situation, building and sustaining relationships with established or potential champions and really remaining as a reliable and responsive resource to them, wow, what an opportunity to join forces with you as experts, again, of your communities, your states where you are, and your legislators with sage wisdom and knowledge about what's really needed and what it really would take procedurally or pragmatically to move your joint efforts forward. And we also know that the reality is that, hey, not everyone is going to be working with a champion as an advocacy target, and that is a-okay and also an exciting opportunity as well. It doesn't mean that you can't make important progress just because they're not already on board. And we would actually caution against eschewing opportunities to collaborate based on any assumed ideology or political affiliation. It's good to get that intel, but it's not a be-all, end-all. And we believe that, in fact, it behooves you as advocates to approach every conversation with the intention to find common ground and commonalities. There are so many causes within this overarching umbrella of trauma-informed policies and practices that many people can coalesce around and align on. And unlikely partners joining together to advocate for change can help shift attitudes and norms in circles that truly, like, you may not otherwise have a lot of influence or reach in. And you can leverage one another's influence once they're on board to bolster the credibility of your transformational advocacy agenda across those traditional divides, which of course increases the likelihood for implementation and progress. And hey, maybe they won't buy into every single thing that you propose, yet certain pieces of your ask resonate with them that they're willing to act on and willing to advocate for. And so as you're collecting information and intel, it can be really helpful to anticipate potential barriers and arguments against your proposed solution, as well as that common ground. So you can sort of strategize around changing hearts and minds where possible and if needed. And for neutral folks and those who may on the surface seem like non-allies, consider, what do they need to know? And from whom do they really need to hear it to be swayed? Maybe you can join forces with another entity or individuals who already have a relationship as well, and thinking about what frame will resonate best with them. Just a lot to consider here. So again, high-level points for you to return to and really think deeply about in the context of where you are. And so regardless of where your advocacy targets currently are at, it's important that you gather information that will be most impactful based upon what you do learn about them. Now, by virtue of, again, all of you being on this call, you probably have some foundational knowledge and perhaps some real specific expertise about trauma and resilience-informed policies and practices. So to ensure credibility among your targets, It's really important to be transparent about what we know to be objectively true based on the evidence we have, what our assumptions, best hopes, and educated hypotheses that we are projecting to them are. And also, that might mean that you need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some certain topics to be able to apprise yourself of the most recent research and all of the different dimensions of these issues. They're pretty complex when you go underneath the surface. And this next slide also has some considerations for you to return to as you formulate your advocacy strategy. Again, just sort of general points that we found to be really effective. A continuation on this slide, and I just want to lift up that this can seem overwhelming. And so, at least in my personal experience, starting with your intended outcomes, after implementation, what would you notice different that would tell you that your strategy was effective and successful? Thinking about that can be a great starting point. And then sort of working backwards to identify insights and resources, both qualitative and quantitative evidence that most clearly supports that solution. You can really build your case around that and get some momentum by starting that way. So for instance, if you're looking at, you notice economic inequality or disproportionate financial instability as a source of perpetuating trauma in your community or adversity or toxic stress, and you're trying to get decision makers to direct funding to support training and technical assistance to implement a trauma-informed approach to early childhood care services, you may find it useful to emphasize the brain science around how positive interactions and healthy attachments at this stage, during which there's just critical construction happening, how that's demonstrated to produce these myriad positive outcomes across individual, family, and community domains, and use the compelling data that really is available to support that positive framework. And you can still make clear, of course, what the quote unquote problem is. We know that early adversity has lasting adverse impacts that can affect people and our society as a whole in really indelible ways. And we can still say that and highlight the solutions and resilience and the possibility for healing and growth that truly exists on the micro, meso, and macro levels. It's a both and, not an either or from our perspective. And on this slide and on the next, you'll just find a couple of infographics. We're just lifting these up because we want to convey that there are resources out there that you can take a look at as a starting point for sort of adjunctive pieces to your storytelling and your visits. Leave behinds really can have a strong at-a-glance impact, keep things on people's minds, keep it front of mind, and maybe front of conversation in their office. And the impact on these concise types of ways to convey evidence tend to resonate and be more approachable than lengthy written documents. So things like infographics, fact sheets, policy briefs, those quick but memorable informational pieces that strengthen and align with your case and which can help decision and policymakers eventually justify their support for your solutions. They might then take them up themselves and share them out. And those can be really effective in our experience. And again, this is another specifically from Star Commonwealth about the challenges of the pandemic and that you may draw inspiration from. We're not saying you have to use these materials, just sort of like, this is something that's really effective that we found has worked. The links are embedded in the slides for you to check out later, and you may have others that you reach for, and that's a-okay too. It's really about keeping this on their minds, keeping it in the conversation. And on this slide, there's also just some information for you to return to later. It's a lot to look at. As you think about the structure for building sustained, meaningful relationships with key decision and policymakers, the meetings that you have, we believe, form that sort of milieu in which some of the most important work is done. And having real relationships instead of just sort of one-off conversations, which can be great, but might not be as productive, tends to contribute to more impactful outcomes. And if you're newer to advocacy, please know that meeting with a staff member instead of directly with the person you might be working to influence is a stellar, exciting, delightful opportunity. Wow. You get more time to make your case with staff than you will likely ever get with a legislator directly. And if you can convince staffers that you speak to that the issue is important and the policy solution that you're proposing is in their wheelhouse and something that will be beneficial to them and the constituents in that area, you are far more likely to actually score an eventual meeting with an elected official themselves if that does happen down the line. And furthermore, staff can often make decisions about what a legislator might support. They have conversations that you might not be a part of. They are in the know about what they already are thinking about with those legislators. And so if you ask for a commitment, if your argument is compelling enough that staff think that it's a great idea, they might be able to answer you on the legislator's behalf right then and there, or if not, get in contact, have a conversation and an ongoing dialogue. Keeping that conversation alive, again, is really a big part of maintaining this relationship, not just having it be a one-off. So with staff, be excited, be respectful, be grateful for the time, and be convincing when you tell your stories of self, us, and now. Now, a bit about this storytelling framework that I'm about to talk about for a couple of minutes. I was fortunate enough to be selected for sponsorship from my school in my MSW program a few years ago to attend the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy's Advocacy Bootcamp program. And this is where I learned this framework. It really resonated with me. It was one of the most impactful aspects of the bootcamp. And it's a framework through which stories that need to be heard can effectively be told in this context. And these stories are really effective. You know, this was an exercise that really stuck with me. Stories they connect people to the data that you've collected. Stories lend an emotional potency and convey urgency. Stories have the power to counter stereotypes and foster connections across divides, as well as strengthen alliances to catalyze action. And so this framework, while I learned it at CRISP, which is the acronym that I said for that long name of the bootcamp that I went to, it actually, as indicated on this slide, originates from Marshall Gans, who is at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And there's a lot more information about this model than the quick primer I'm going to give you today. If you're curious to learn more, you can give it a Google. At a high level, the story of self, which is the first circle on the left there, this involves you really just describing the events, the challenges, the choices that led you to act as you are here as an advocate today. So being really judicious about what we include in our story based on what we've learned about our target audience and their values can really enhance motivation to take action toward change. My guess is there are parts that align there when you really dig deep. And maybe there's a lot of overlap in what brought you to the work and your experiences and maybe your advocacy target has made comment to similar experiences, or they've supported similar things in the past. So taking that into consideration and choosing very strategically what you share about what brought you to the work in an authentic and effective way. Then moving to the story of us, which captures those shared values, experiences, and capacities of folks joining together as we all are to work toward change. So that could be us as a national advocacy network, a more localized advocacy group with whom you're affiliated, or my personal preference, members of your community with lived experience and providers and survivors alike. The fact of the matter is, as constituents, you have power, and decision makers will listen to you and others for that reason much more than they'll listen to those of us who are here in the swamp, the shining city on the hill, whatever you want to call us here in the DC area. You matter, your voices matter, and you can strengthen the story of us through connecting with community members. And I do want to mention here that in this part, as I mentioned that, it's important to consider who is the appropriate messenger for some of the information that you may glean through those conversations. Just assure that you're getting permission to share any specific stories if you're integrating that into the conversation that may otherwise not directly be yours to tell, in which case maybe you can bring someone with you to support your advocacy efforts, teach them this framework and have them tell their story of self and join together for the story of us. There are a lot of different ways that you can use these pieces to create change. It's a very general and flexible framework. And as a side note, just because we're talking about community connections, engaging with people with lived experience when formulating solutions in general is a vital part of this process of advocacy to assure that your proposed solutions actually fit the needs and preferences of those who are most directly impacted. So staying connected to that is important. And then the story of now really outlines the current challenges in a way that presents a vision for change and a potential outcome that is powerful, productive, and within reach if your advocacy targets were to join the effort. So a part of this is really highlighting the urgency of the situation, as we mentioned before, as well as those positive solutions, and summoning your target audience to take concrete next steps to bring about change. So really making the quote unquote ask, if you will. And so this framework basically taken together is here's the challenge, here's how I'm involved, here's how community members and constituents are impacted. Here's why it's relevant to you. And here's a solution for action grounded in a realistic sense of hope to make a meaningful impact that we can only achieve with your help. And with this powerful framework, your targets can begin to sort of see themselves as the hero character in this story, which can move them to act and join this movement in a really powerful way. And this is certainly, I just want to say, this is just one framework for storytelling that I'm excited to share with you because it resonated with me. Many of you are seasoned advocates and you might have found something that works better for you, and that's wonderful as well. So hopefully for those who are hoping for some guidance or a starting point to build on and just thinking about, okay, I have all these facts, I don't really know how to put a narrative together yet. Hopefully this is a good foundation to build on as you formulate your own story to tell. And finally, I just want to call attention to the fact that we know it can be intimidating to put some of this out there in the first place. There are so many different competing demands, and we want to remind you that at the campaign, we're here to support you and that your efforts are also supported by a substantial network of tenacious, ardent advocates. All of the progress that Dan and Jesse made comment to earlier could not be possible without the people on this call and other advocates doing this work. And there are so many lessons learned and resources to be shared to help you make the greatest impact so that you can cut through some of the other noise and tell your story in a way that contributes to change. The more of us that get out there and tell these stories, the more likely our vision of a preferred future that uses this incredible opportunity that Dan's going to talk to you about in just a second after I stop flapping my mouth to direct funding to that which honors lived experience and promotes healing and growth and resiliency and prevents further harm from happening. And so with that, I am going to pass it to Dan to shine a spotlight on some of the specific actions that you can lift up and make the ask for in your advocacy efforts.
Dan, you are still on mute.
Yeah, you might
I
be
know,
muted.
I will go back on mute then.
yeah. Before we get into ARPA, a couple of follow-up comments to Whitney, and actually to my earlier statements. The successes we had with the Appropriations Committee would not have been possible without our partner, the National Prevention Sciences Coalition, chaired by Denny Fishpine. So Denny, thank you. It's been a wonderful partnership, and your connections really opened lots of doors for us. Secondly, our long-term goal, as I mentioned, is to have the committee direct every relevant federal program to incorporate trauma-informed ideas. We want them, put them into the Title I program. We want every school to be directed to use some of the Title I money for trauma-informed programs. We want the mental health grant program recipients to be told to do trauma-informed. For us to succeed at that, we need success stories. There's nothing that succeeds like success. You're the ones who are experiencing those success stories at your local level. Please share those with us so we can share them with the Appropriations Committee, share them with your elected officials, but give them to us too, so we can demonstrate that trauma informed programs are making the difference. But we have data showing a school implemented trauma informed procedures and was able to reduce suspensions by 85%. That's the kind of success story that just really grabs people. Hard data that addresses the problem they're concerned about. Excuse me a second. So, but what we'd like to talk about is two things. One is money that's already flowing to you. And secondly, a piece of legislation that I think would make everyone on this call's life a lot easier, which is money for local trauma-informed community coalitions. But the American Rescue Plan Act is throwing out money like crazy into your communities. And the document on the screen and the document Jesse is, I think, will make available on the chat site goes through it all. I just want to touch on a couple. One is the schools. Local education agencies are getting $122 billion. And it's going right down to them, not through the state. That gives them the resources they've never had before to implement trauma-informed programs. So reach out to your LEAs and encourage them to implement trauma-informed programs. The money is one-time money, but implementing the trauma-informed program, most of the costs are upfront. Training your staff, your counselors, having somebody who's capable of watching the program and helping it move forward in the future. Could be a regular staff person. So you can do it with one-time money. Why don't you go on to the Child Care and Development Block Grant got a huge increase. A lot of money for child abuse prevention programs. Those programs, that money will be flowing down to local nonprofit organizations. So sometimes through the state, sometimes directly from SAMHSA and other federal agencies. So keep alert for RFPs coming out. They've got a lot of money, they've got to spend it, and they're working as fast as they can to get it out of Washington and into your communities. Next slide. I'm going to skip over a couple of these, you'll see it. The other big one I want to focus on is state, local governments and tribal governments. The ARPA has given, I can't remember the number, 200 and some odd billion dollars directly to local governments, not to states, but to county, municipalities, cities, going right down to the local level. And we're hearing that these local jurisdictions are drowning in money. If you ever had that kind of problem, they are struggling to figure out in a lot of communities how to use that money, because it came out of the blue, kind of fell out of the sky, and it's an opportunity to approach your local governments to encourage them to use some of that money to implement trauma-informed programs, showing them that an investment now will save them money going forward by reducing so many of the problems that impose costs on local governments, whether it's opioid use disorder or kids dropping out of school and getting into the prison pipeline, or obesity that adds to all their health costs. So if they invest this money now, it's going to save them money down the road. So get a hold of your tribal governments. I mean, your local state governments. You're lost. Let's try it again. Get a hold of your local governments. They're people you probably know in your community, the city council person, the county offices, and start talking to them in exactly the way that Whitney described. And as far as tribal governments are getting $20 billion. Again, a real windfall, one-time money. Tribal governments are in charge of communities that have suffered so severely from historical trauma, and on top of that, adverse childhood experiences. And they can use this money to begin correcting the problems that have been around for 500 years because of colonialism. So that's a highlight of ARPA. There are a lot of other little pots of money. Just keep your ears open, checking for these RFPs coming out of the federal government, coming out of state governments, and get in the face of your local governments, because they're the ones who are getting the most money, and they're the ones who are still searching for how to make the best use of that money for their community. Okay, moving on. ARPA's a reality. The Rise from Trauma Act is one of our greatest fantasies. CTIPP's view, and I think all of the organizations involved today, recognize that the most effective way to address trauma is through local cross-sector trauma-informed coalitions. It has to happen at the local level, and it has to happen on a cross-sector basis. No one institution can do it by itself. And many of you are part of local trauma-informed coalitions, and many of you are facing the problem that we hear about over and over again. You just don't have money. And it takes money to hire staff to make things happen. The Rise from Trauma Act is a bipartisan piece of legislation introduced by Senators Durbin and Duckworth from Illinois, both Democrats, Senator Capito from West Virginia, and Murkowski from Alaska, both Republicans. And what we're going to be asking for you is, after we go through the act, is to reach out to your senators. They're all home or on their way home for their August recess, if not there already, and get a hold of them if any way you can, and encourage them to co-sponsor this act. And what it would do is, first and foremost, it would authorize $600 million in grants to local trauma-informed coalitions, cross-sector coalitions. It's a huge amount of money. When the act was first introduced, the bill was first introduced a couple of years ago, they were talking about $40 million. And I think thanks to the advocacy of CTIPP and lots of other groups, they recognized the need was so great. So if we could get $600 million pouring into every community to implement their trauma-informed cross-sector coalitions, the movement would, I think it would achieve our dream of making America a trauma-informed country. A second key provision in the bill is the Performance Partnership Program. Those of you who work at the local level probably are frustrated. You get federal money coming down in silos, and you can't use the suicide money to address opioid addiction because they're different pots of money. But we know that trauma is the underlying cause of both suicide and opioid addiction. I'm sorry, my cat's trying to get into my desk here. The pilot, the Performance Partnership Program would allow local communities to put money from different discretionary federal grant programs into a single pot and use that money to develop a comprehensive approach for addressing trauma in the community. So it helps you break down the silos. There are, I don't want to tie up, let me see, there were 2 or 3 other ones, that provisions in there. There's money to grants to hospitals to reduce readmissions. They let people out who have drug problems, who committed suicide. And if you don't provide continuing care, they end up back in the hospital. It costs the government a huge amount of money, as well as costs a lot of lives and a lot of pain. So there are grants to hospitals to be able to stick with these patients after they let them back onto into the community, to help them, support them, so they don't end up being readmitted. There's also a number of programs addressing law enforcement. They would create a law enforcement coordinating center that would advise law enforcement agencies around the country on how to become trauma informed. And it also would make grants to local law enforcement agencies to help them implement trauma-informed programs. And that's been a CTIPP priority. We've had some great presentations by Becky Haas and her team on law enforcement agencies that have become trauma-informed. And if this provision is enacted, it would provide some federal direction, and it would provide funding for local law enforcement agencies to do what Becky has described have been done in a few communities. So there's a lot in this act. I don't want to take up too much more time other than to, again, encourage you to reach out to your senators, to your staff, using all those great techniques that this young but suddenly very smart young lady, I had no idea you had so much experience with this. It was terrific, Whitney. But use those approaches you described to get to your senators. You've got the rest of August while they're home, and tell them to support this act. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. It will save money, it will save lives, and it will make your community a much healthier community. So Jesse, unless there are any other questions, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, we'll get to Q&A in a bit. We're going to go through our little workshop so that you can all practice your pitch. So don't hesitate to put some questions into the chat. We'll keep a queue of that. But just before we get into it, just to put in the chat, if you have not already joined the National Trauma Campaign, please fill out this link. I see folks taking action on the Rise from Trauma Act. That is greatly appreciated. While we try to reach out to people who haven't signed up for the National Trauma Campaign, it is helpful to have those folks in our network. Please also share that link with others as well. And so folks have it, we have a little local liaison training on the site as well for folks to go through. On page 4, Representative Andrew Hevesy, or Assemblyman Andrew Hevesy, who leads the Legislators Invested in Fighting Trauma, or LIFT group, gives his perspective on why ACEs and trauma-informed care are so important. And it's really, really impactful to hear his perspective as a policymaker on how to advocate why what we're advocating for is so impactful. And the last thing that I'll add is that Whitney is not suddenly so smart. She has been that way for as long as I've known her, and I am confident much longer than that as well. And so Whitney, I will turn it back over to you to go through the advocacy workshop, and then we'll get to all of the questions.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And yeah, as Jesse mentioned now, and also in the email that he distributed to the network before this call, we're going to ask a lot of you today. We're going to ask you to take some time to practice framing your own story to advocate for trauma and resilience-informed change. And so for those unfamiliar with the idea of sort of an elevator speech, imagine you're walking up to an elevator to go up to a very high floor because of the timing that we're going to have. It's going to be a little longer of an elevator ride. And you notice that you'll be sharing that ride with someone important to get support for your cause. How would you convince them in that short time that you're sharing that space to get on board? And yeah, it's a little bit of a lengthier elevator ride. We're aiming for about 3 to 4 minutes for just sort of drafting and practicing and thinking about this and digesting this information, making meaning of it, maybe for the first time for some of you. Maybe it's an old elevator, or you get off on the same floor and do a walk and talk with your legislator till one of you reaches the destination. So aim for about 3 or 4 minutes is sort of the sweet spot that we're thinking about for now. And the idea, again, is that you're telling your story in as concise and impactful of a way as possible. And we're going to give you about 5 minutes of independent working time to consider and or jot down some notes about what you think is worthwhile to include and put these pieces together in your elevator speech. And then we'll put you in randomly generated breakout rooms for about 8 minutes in dyads, twos, if there's an even number, fingers crossed, to give your draft elevator speech to each other. And then we'll bring you back and just debrief a little bit in the larger group about the process, and there will be opportunities to discuss and ask questions. But before I go ahead and pop some music on so it's not weirdly silent for the 5 minutes of independent thinking and reflection time, I'm just wondering, any questions for Jesse, Dan, or I, or anybody at this time before we send you to do your thing?
We have a few questions, Whitney, but none of them are necessarily pertinent to
Related to the elevator speech?
Yeah, so
Cool.
I will say we go into that just so folks know. I have
Awesome.
had literal conversations since I moved to DC in the elevator with several Congress people. And so this workshop is very, very important in case you ever find yourself in the same situation.
Mhm. Thanks, Jesse. And okay, so I will circle back in about 5 minutes. I'm going to share my screen and a little timer video so you know what time you have left. Then we'll get you into breakouts and we'll check in again after this 5-minute period. So for now, please go ahead and put your elevator speeches together. And if you have any questions as you go along, feel free to message Jesse or I as well.
I'm not moving. Didn't go anywhere.
Okay, so I have built the breakout rooms. I'm about to open them for about 8 minutes. I can send little reminders at sort of the 5-minute mark, and then you have 1 minute before we bring you back, Mark. Any residual questions, thoughts, anything to share?
I have a quick question. Can you go back to just the 3 bubbles again?
Oh yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
You got it, of course. Anything else before we send you all away?
Whitney, for 2 folks who just joined the call, I'm wondering if you just want to do a quick, like 30-second to a minute pitch of what this is as we go into the breakout rooms to remind folks about what they'll be sharing.
Sure, absolutely. So right now we're asking people to put together sort of a quick elevator speech of key points that they would want to convey to somebody who is a stakeholder decision maker in administering trauma-informed programming practices, policies. And we talked about the specific framework that is on the screen now, which essentially is what is the thing that brings you to this work? How are efforts already happening? How are people uniting and coalescing around this cause? What do you feel like is important for folks to know in terms of your advocacy efforts, whatever your target is? And what is your ask? That's really at the end of the day, what is your ask? What are you asking for action to be, what action are you asking to be taken from the person that you are speaking with? And if you have questions, you also can raise your hand in the breakout room and I can come pop in if that quick and dirty sort of overview is not sufficient, that's fine too. But for now, I will open the rooms and a couple people it looks like dropped off. So if you're alone for any reason, I'll move you so you're with a partner. Just be aware that you might be moved around a little bit. All right. The rooms are open and we'll see you back in about 8 minutes. It was mostly an even number, Jesse. Can you believe that?
I am so glad to hear.
Let's see.
And so, yeah, I'll let you continue to work the breakout rooms. And for the time being, Dan, because we're still recording and it's just going to be the 3 of us for a time being, while for those of you who are watching the recording, we certainly encourage for you to have gone through that exercise. And if you have, feel free to mute myself and our conversation that we're going to have in the meantime, and practice your pitch. Feel free to create that, develop it, practice it on your own. I often tape myself and then scrutinize myself on the replay, and you can do that or whatever works for you. But just so that way we're not just sitting here in silence throughout the recording. Dan, I'm wondering if for folks who are watching the recording, you can sort of go through maybe either some of the advocacy work that you've done, especially around Native American tribes throughout the last 50 or so years, or if you would want to sort of do your practice pitch for RISE more so than what you were just doing in terms of sharing the information, or even around school districts with LEAs beyond what you said when introducing ARPA and RISE.
I
saw you
selfishly
say,
would love to hear Dan's elevator speech.
right?
Okay. I guess the thing I've learned, I find it fascinating that the key to a good trauma, to help somebody who suffered from trauma is good relationships. And it's also the key, oh, my advisor just arrived here, okay. The key to successful lobbying is relationships. What you want to do is develop a kind of relationship with a staffer where they see you as a resource, not somebody who's just hounding them and demanding things, but you're providing them with information that makes their job easier. They're always looking for good, reliable sources of information, particularly what's going on in their community. And you can provide that role, and you can build from that to gradually educate them about everything you know about trauma. So they end up having the same knowledge that you have, and therefore the same interest in promoting it. So it's not a one night stand. It's an ongoing relationship. And the key to that relationship is honesty. Staff will try you out and see if they can rely on you. They'll ask you for something, and if they find out the information you're giving them is not true, you're dead. You might as well just pack up your bag and go home. The first time they find they can't trust you, they're not going to listen to you anymore. But if you provide them trustworthy information, even if it's information that's harmful to your own position, letting them know you're willing to let them tell them the negatives as well as the positives, they will learn to trust you and see you as a resource. And that's really your goal, is for them to see you as an adjunct of their own staff, somebody they can turn to for answer questions they get from constituents, questions they get from their boss about why are we pushing this issue or that issue. So develop those relationships, and I just find it so funny that the term relationship is the key to trauma. It's healing from trauma. It's the key to good lobbying.
How long have those relationships taken you to cultivate in Congress over the years?
Oh, they can take a couple of months. They can take a couple of years. It's easier being in Washington when you can go up to the Hill and schmooze with people. But in the old days, it used to be able to take people out to lunch. Now you're prohibited from taking congressional staffers out to lunch. But it's really the belief that all you need to do is buy someone, a staffer, a couple martinis, and you were able to get what you want. It's just no longer true. And I really haven't had much experience doing it virtually, but I know that working in your own community, every senator, every congressperson has a local office, and those people are accessible, and those are the ones you really need to develop first. And they in turn can introduce you to people in the Washington office, and they can vouch for your credibility. They can vouch that you have valuable information. So it's kind of hard to do it long distance, though you can, but it's even easier to do it if you begin with people in the Senate or Congressperson's local office and then build from there to Washington.
And in the
So
oh, go ahead.
It takes time, but you're succeeding even before you have a full relationship. You're having an impact that just grows. It's not suddenly you're a accepted advocate. It builds over time, but they're also, even in the beginning, they're listening to you and taking what you have to say and putting it to work.
And in the virtual world, we've seen tremendous possibilities with work with district staff. It seems like district staff actually may have some more time for meetings with constituents specifically. And so don't hesitate to reach out to those district offices, give them calls, and they'll get back to you and connect you with the right staffers unless you know the right staffer to reach out to. And then they may be willing to have a conversation. Dan, the last question, because I think we're wrapping up in terms of time before people come back from the breakout rooms. We have 3 minutes. Is when, look, in our political lives, people stop, people retire, obviously, and then other times people will, not win the next election and staffs change and turn over. Do you have any recommendations? I know that may feel like a deflating experience for some people who have developed and cultivated a relationship with a staffer and then feel like they have to do it again. Do you have any, advice?
Yeah, first of all, pick winners. So that solves your biggest problem. But what's fascinating about the Hill is that there's a huge amount of rotation, that somebody's working for a senator or congressperson who loses an election, and there's a fraternity or sorority, I would want to call it, up on the Hill, that your friends in other offices will help you find another job. So today you may be working for Senator X. She loses her election. A couple of months later, you're going to be working for Senator Y, who wants to hire somebody with experience. So staffers don't sometimes, but very often do not disappear. They just are, they reemerge in a different office. So retain those relationships, because even if that person is not in your state, you still can have an impact on that office because you've developed a relationship. Other than that, yeah, very often you got to start all over again. And that's just the nature of the beast.
Good news, if you do feel like you have to start over again, you have a playbook, right? There has been success where you've cultivated that relationship. Dan, I love the advice of pick winners, especially for folks who are we're telling them as constituents. So move to the right areas where your representatives and senators are already winners. But if not, you have that playbook of how you cultivated the relationship the first time. And sure, there are new characters and there's new personalities and perhaps new interests that you have to work with, but you've done it before and you can feel certain that you'll know how to do it again. And that,
I mean, once you've done it, you're really very comfortable. I did a lot of work with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. It turned over regularly, but you just felt comfortable now talking to them, and you would say, I was working with your predecessor, and then you just picked right up. So the transition isn't that difficult to a new staffer.
for those who are just joining us again, we sort of were interviewing Dan and Whitney and I, putting in our own thoughts. So that way for folks watching the recording on YouTube, it wasn't just us sitting blankly. And so you got the tail end of that. Feel free to tune into that portion of the YouTube recording for some more information. But Whitney, I'll turn it over to you so that way we can facilitate sort of some follow-up from that activity and then get to the Q&A before we end.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jesse. And thanks to everyone. Thanks for your patience. We know that there were some technical difficulties and some people ended up having to leave partway through. So hopefully you found some useful ways to use that time and brainstorm together, idea share, present some ideas to each other. The thing about storytelling is that it's interactive, right? It's a form of social transaction and can therefore only be learned by telling and listening and telling and listening and getting feedback and trying it on for size. So after having the chance to hopefully do that a little bit after one round of this, we would like to debrief with you a bit about this experience. And I wouldn't be a social worker if I didn't just love to talk about process. So anyone can unmute and respond, or you can contribute in the chat and Jesse will lift the comments up if you prefer. Totally your choice, how and whether you participate. But just to start, wondering what it was like drafting and delivering your elevator speech, and also curious for folks who got to it, what was your ask?
Just got attacked by my cat.
Whitney, my name is Nancy. I'm from Delaware. I was teamed with Teresa, and then Riza got to join us after the fact. I mean, like after it started, so it was good to have the triad. And all three of us were Eastern Shore, like, you know, Eastern Seaboard kind of people. So that was kind of interesting that we are not too far from each other. But both Teresa and I, our ask is for more time. Like, so we give some kind of overview and say, have you heard about this? I'd love the chance to explain to you. And or there's this bill being proposed, and I'd love to have a chance to have a conversation with you about that or one of your staff. So both of us had this space where we were asking for more time. So we were giving them the kind of teasers. I came from like a more personal perspective. This is why everybody can recognize and identify with this process, because we are all products of our upbringing, some of it for the good, some of it for the bad, where I'm going to change the way I do some things, because I like Teresa's approach. She's better at recognizing faces and names, though. So she says she sees somebody and she remembers where she last saw them and says, I remember seeing you at such and such an event. I wish I had that memory, because I don't always, so I don't want to put myself where I'm going, like standing there going, humana, I think I've seen you before, that's not good. Where she's really crackerjack at being able to say, you were at this event with me, and what did you think about that? So she's immediately engaged by where they've already been, which I thought that has to sound really complimentary to somebody who's in a position of power. Is like, wow, this person remembers me from last June or last July, so I loved her approach. I do the, here's how we are all connected kind of humanity approach.
Beautiful. Wow, such diversity of perspectives and just a dyad than a triad. And sounds like
Right.
you got some ideas from each other and really were able to notice each other's strengths and skills and how those can be amplified. Some of us have very good face memories, some of us do not.
And Whitney, I'd like to just add a
please
cheat.
do.
A cheat too is that usually if I'm in an elevator, because I told her that that's happened to me before, a lot of times when you start an elevator speech, it's because you recognize the person for some reason. So sometimes it will be I recognize you from the event, which happens a lot because our city is not that large. Or you're in a community or you're in an event where a lot of people who are somewhat similar or whatever would be there. The other thing would be recognizing somebody based on the shared experience of where we are. Like you're on an elevator because you work in the same place, or because you recognize the person's your council person or your state legislator, or you recognize the person for whatever reason. So my cheat is that I will use the thing that I recognize them from and sort of start to build that, oh, hey, like I call her Councilwoman McGee. So Councilwoman McGee, well, why would I recognize her? Because I'm interested in schools. She's really good on schools, or she did some great thing, or I saw her at National Night Out at the local school. And I would say, hey, I saw you at whatever, thanks for that. And then I would find a way to segue to the thing that I care about that I want to connect with her on. So
Brilliant.
That's my cheat.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for lifting that up and sharing that. Man, I imagine that that's really effective.
And
Thank you.
And just to lift up a few points in the chat, that's
Thanks,
really
Jesse.
based on relationships, right? And you're really lifting up the relational approach that's so important to all advocacy efforts. So thank you both for those, for the story and the examples.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for this.
Oh, glad you found the time useful. Is that a comment in the chat, Jesse? Sorry, I have so many screens up. I can't tell. Would you mind
you're
reading
all
that?
good.
I saw the one
I
up here.
accidentally pressed on news first. I think one from Alex, I think one key piece of the elevator speech is to provide clear examples of the return on investment of trauma-informed care. What good examples of the return on investment can be shared? The one that I think is most impactful that is out there is there was a recent World Health Organization study that measured the impact of ACEs on workforce productivity. And essentially it found that 3 of the ACEs and just a small number of the associated behavioral health and social outcomes cost the United States over $748 billion in lost productivity every year. To put that into context, that same year, the entire Department of Defense budget in 2019 was $738 billion. So we're talking about an overwhelming amount of money, but we can also look at other examples. There are Medicaid costs. The state of Arizona just looked at women using Medicaid as a result of ACEs, and that number was right around $250 million. If you want to look that up, it was done in the Morrison Institute. We can also look at BRFIS data, or behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which Dan talked about earlier. And that information can help complement the data for specific areas, as different states and counties have different purpose data sets. And so the return on investment is huge, 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 because the money that people put in, the money that we're asking policymakers to put in, we expect to see that come out many, many times. And if you've ever seen the film Resilience, it highlights the work in Washington State done by the Family Policy Council. And in 10 years, we saw a conservative estimate of a return on investment of $1.1 billion. And that's just of what they were able to measure in that short amount of time. When these programs continue, we can expect to see continual growth and continual returns on that investment over time, right? And so that's a great, great question. And to Kathleen's point, the infographics that we shared earlier, and I'm happy to put back in the chat, have some really, really good data on the ROI for trauma-informed programs.
Yeah, let me jump in here for a second. As you start running trauma-informed programs in your community and you see ROI, please share that with us. We need more data. We just don't have enough ROI data out there. So please share with us.
I just want to jump in here quickly.
Thanks, Kathleen.
I want to say thank you. First off, this was a phenomenal webinar. So thank you, all of you. And this exercise is a perfect time for me personally, because our state legislature is going back early September, second week of September, to work on how they're going to spend and drill down in the budget for line items for ARPA. And we're doing universal home visiting, and our task force at the state is pushing for more funding for community health workers to be in tandem with the universal home visiting, because none of us believe it is sustainable without the people in the community helping with the hospital workers. So just being able to put my head around that and reminding, practicing with Carla, who was phenomenal as well, her first time out doing that speech. So that was great. But to be able to start in my head thinking about it before we go into September was a great help. So thank you.
Glad this came at a great time for you. Thank you for sharing. And man, what a better time to really emphasize the importance of home visiting. Thank you.
Yeah, because we're getting ready to get locked down again.
We know that this time is very difficult for everybody, right? There was a taste of that semblance of perhaps normalcy again, and now we're falling back into maybe a tough time of having to go back to wearing masks, perhaps not being able to do all the things that we had craved for so long. And we hope that, this is something that continues to bring energy and purpose. And again, for most of us, the meetings were virtual the entire time anyway. And so the advocacy efforts the whole time will be very similar. But James, to your point, this is very difficult for all of us. And aside from the advocacy piece of all of this, we hope that you're all doing well, and that you and your families and other close friends are as well.
And also
Let's make sure of that.
Yeah, and to build off of what Jesse mentioned, just these community-based approaches, we've seen the way that the needle of public opinion can sway policy. We know that right now we can see the needs in our communities better than anybody else, and to have these community-forward, community-based approaches integrated into your advocacy, what a wonderful thing to hear at a time when that is so deeply important. Adrian, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead and share.
Yeah, just wanting to share with, I was talking with Derek and in our breakout, and one of the things that we talked about was just sharing what we are currently working on, and that's the same thing we would ask a legislator is like, what are they currently working on? What's their, they might start telling you what they're most stressed about or what their favorite project is, and then kind of translating what they are working on into maybe some trauma-informed strategy will help them. And so it'll be most relevant and very targeted, and it would be very hard to prepare for, but at the same time, it's kind of like, it's that relational approach about how can we help you and appreciate all of the great work that they are doing. And then I think they are, I think that approach is going to be more well received than if you start just talking at them nonstop for, 3 or 4 minutes. I'm sure, their brain is going to shut down. So that's been something that has really helped. And, just appreciate kind of all of these angles and information and infographics and data that as they want to learn more, then we can kind of, plant the seeds as that kind of relationship grows. But thank you so much. I think that's very, very helpful.
Thank you, Adrian. You got snaps, which is like the highest level of compliments in Zoom calls, I believe. So thank you for that information and that perspective as well. As we come to a close here, thank you all for your participation, for your engagement with this, and for sticking with us for the last 90 minutes or so. There were 2 questions in the chat, and then we can get to some others. If there are any, as always, happy to stay on a little bit longer. One was about the Strong Support for Children's Act, which was introduced by Representative Ayanna Pressley and supported by Representative Carolyn Maloney out of New York and Massachusetts, reverse respectively. So Ayanna Pressley's from Boston, Carolyn Maloney's from New York State. And that essentially is working to help local public health agencies determine how trauma is impacting the most marginalized communities in our country and ways to effectively mitigate and prevent ACEs and other forms of trauma. It also calls out racism, poverty, and other forms of trauma throughout society in a broad way, and also recognizes the intergenerational nature of those traumas. And so we are also mobilizing around the Strong Support for Children's Act. In the chat, you'll see the link similar to what we did for the Rise from Trauma Act, where you can fill that out, take action, reach out to your representatives to co-sponsor or support that bill. The only reason that we didn't cover that is not because it is not important, but as you can see, we're already at time, and we just wanted to stick to Rise is moving through the Senate in high fashion right now, and we are working very hard for co-sponsors. And with the American Rescue Plan Act, those funds are likely going to be moved by the end of September. And so we just wanted to make sure that we highlighted those few, but there are other opportunities that we continue to mobilize around. If you sign up for the National Trauma Campaign, you'll receive our newsletter in the coming weeks, which you should have, which will have information on RISE, ARPA, strong support, and other advocacy opportunities as well. And so if you haven't already done so, again, I'll put the link in the chat again to sign up for the National Trauma Campaign, get others to sign up. And then the other question, which I will ask of you, Dan, is a quick description, and it can be brief, of the movement to include the RISE Act in reconciliation and what that means. There was a question about that earlier.
You need to wait until the spam call gets over. The reconciliation package, it's the $3.5 trillion package that President Biden has been pushing Congress to enact. It's called reconciliation because it's going to go through a process that can allow it to pass with only 50 votes in the Senate. It can't be filibustered. There's an effort under, what it does is it creates a broad framework for money that each appropriations committee gets to operate on, it gets to appropriate for. And then the appropriations committee and the authorizing committee then decide how they want to spend that money. I'm not aware of one of the efforts is to get the RISE Act funding into the reconciliation bill. If they do that, $4.8 billion, there would be no need to fight for appropriations every year. The money would be there automatically as a result of this reconciliation process. I don't know the status of it. I don't think we know yet. The House, the Senate has designed its reconciliation bill, very broad categories. It hasn't drilled down to the issue as small as only $4.8 billion. And the House has not designed its bill yet. So the answer is I don't know where things stand, but it's all an inside game. There's not much we've been asked to do on it. other than to create support for the RISE Act, which is why we're encouraging everyone to go out and ask your senator to co-sponsor it. But we haven't been asked to do any lobbying on the reconciliation bill because that's all an inside game.
So folks know I had a conversation with a staffer earlier today, and there will be similar action on the House side, but again, no real lobbying, just we want to drum up as much support. The House side is getting ready to introduce their side of the RISE Act. And so they want to support pretty much the same ask that we made on the Senate side for that $4.8 billion to be in the reconciliation bill. So that way we don't have to fight for it through appropriations. And with that, those were the only questions that I remember or think I saw in the chat at least. Is there any? Yeah, so if there are other questions that we didn't answer, please feel free to come off mute or put them in the chat now. And if not, for those who are hopping off, thank you again for joining us and being a part of the movement. This is just the beginning or toward the beginning of it, at least. We look forward to continuing to grow momentum and changing the way that systems operate in our country work, or the way that systems operate in our country over time. The work of advocacy is ongoing, and we are grateful for all of your participation in whatever form you decide, and hope that we can continue to nurture you and your networks along throughout the long haul of this process. So thank you very much. We'll stay on for the next little bit, but if we don't see you for another month, take care, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you
Okay.
all.
And
Just
slides
the
will be sent. Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah.
Someone asked about slides, and slides will be sent. I know Google Docs can be persnickety sometimes. I wasn't able to drop them directly, but they will be sent. Go ahead, Chaplain. Sorry about that.
James,
Jesse, I have a statement. You want to hear it?
I do, James. I always do. You know that.
Okay. Remember the last time I told you I was working with the consulting with the police commissioner here in New York?
Yes. How is that going?
They took me to what was it? The police academy. They brought me from my house to their house, lights and sirens. I felt like a real VIP. But anyway, when I got there, there was the guard squad. It was like a training kind of thing. And they were interested in creating a trauma mobile. And I told them all about my trauma experience and what I know and about the funding and everything. They said they want me on their team. But being that
great.
we're in Brooklyn, they want me to like they're gonna train me and then they want me to build in the Bronx and Manhattan. Isn't that great?
James, that's
That is
incredible. And
Yeah.
I mean, truly a testament to what I was just saying, years and years of work. And I know how personal that is to you. So congrats. I mean, just the utmost congratulations. That's
Well,
incredible.
thank you.
Hey, James, what happened to Queens? I was born in Queens. You didn't mention Queens.
No, the God Squad happens to be in Brooklyn. I know nothing. Queens and Brooklyn is out of my territory. So
You'll take it one borough at a time, right?
The police academy was in Queens, but
Okay.
it was sponsored by the Brooklyn God Squad, and
Okay.
so that's how Queens got in it.
Congrats. Congrats,
That's where
James.
it
That's
was at.
awesome.
Great work. Great work.
What a great
Thank
way
you.
to end the
It's
call.
only just beginning now.
That's absolutely right.
Now the
Yeah.
hard part starts. But at least I'm finally seeing light at the end of my tunnel.
That must feel good, yeah?
Yes, great.
I bet. Well, congrats, James. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
That's an incredible way to end this CTIPP CAN call.
Okay. And you have a great day.
You too. We'll see you all very, very soon. Take care.